As we drive by our forests today and see the beautiful green everywhere, it's hard to believe what existed back in the 1930s. I remember as a child playing in a big gully, 2 stories high. That was my playground. Why? Time and time again for years, local farmers had subsistence farming, putting nothing back into the ground, local timber cutters cutting everything inside, leaving nothing but just brush. Fire, widespread. With that fire, everything's gone its path, because right behind it comes flood, and down the creek and down the river, down the Mississippi and in the ocean went our land.
That was Dr. Harley Jolly, and you'll hear more from him later in this episode. Today on Exploring North Carolina, we're going to tell you a story from an often overlooked period of North Carolina history, the Great Depression of the 1930s.
We know that during the Depression, many people lost their savings, jobs, farms, and some even lost their dignity. What we often forget is that in the 1930s, much of our land also suffered from unsustainable farming practices and from generations of shoddy or non-existent forest management. We know that many people of all walks of life needed help. Some got that help in the form of New Deal work programs that offered a job, a paycheck, and much more.
And some of the programs also help to heal a scarred land. And that's our story today on Exploring North Carolina, giving nature a hand.
Today, North Carolina is blessed with productive farms and by magnificent forests that cover private lands, state and national forests and parks. But we haven't always taken care of our now abundant forest. To get a quick overview of our forest before the widespread use of modern sustainable forestry practices, we went to Harry Warren, Director of the North Carolina Museum of Forestry in Whiteville, North Carolina.
Well, the forest industry has always been an important part of North Carolina's history and economy. And this goes way back to before the state even became a state, when we were still a colony of the British Empire. I mean, the British Empire, their power rested on the great wooden sailing fleets that they had. And those sailing fleets were kept afloat by naval stores, that is, tar, pitch, and turpentine. The British, when they saw the great stands of longleaf pines in North Carolina, they must have thought that they had fallen into heaven, because suddenly they had what seemed to be an endless supply.
And it was treated as an endless supply, with liquid gold rosin, the lifeblood of the pine forest, flowing out of the state in cask and barrels.
Naval stores, that is the production of tar, pitch, and turpentine, continued to be a major economic factor in North Carolina through the 19th century, really into the early 20th century. But after the Civil War, it started fading away. There were several factors to that, not the least of which was the huge stands of longleaf pines were the naval stores industry was finally taking its toll on them, and they just weren't as available as they had been. The industry moved south, and the naval stores workers followed, South Carolina, Georgia, and ultimately settling in Florida. What took its place was lumbering itself. You had these huge swaths of trees in the western part of the state and in the eastern, northeastern part of the state that really had not been tapped into. And these men looked at these and they saw what looked like an endless natural resource. So they did what was natural to them. They just started chopping down trees that supplied the wood for a lot of the building that was going on in the industrial northeast at the time. And there wasn't a whole lot of thought given to replanting or regeneration of the forest, because it just looked like there was so much of it out there. Forestry started undergoing some drastic changes by the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. Gone were the days where a few fellows would load up a log raft up the Cape Fear River and float it down to Wilmington, sell everything on the raft, sell the raft itself, and then make their way back on the dirt road to their farm up in Duplin or Bladen County or Sampson County. Those days were gone, and the industry was changing.
At the beginning of the 20th century, people were aware that forest had been neglected. In 1898, the first School of Forestry in the United States opened its doors near Brevard. North Carolina State and Duke University later opened schools of forestry, but we'll tell their stories another day. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, the land still bore the scars of generations of neglect. The mills closed and people lost jobs, making textiles and furniture. Both people and the land needed help. Help came in the form of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. North Carolina's foremost expert on the CCC is Dr. Harley Jolly, distinguished retired professor of history at Mars Hill College, who himself was a member of the CCC. After reading his extraordinary book on the Civilian Conservation Corps in North Carolina, I was privileged to ask him personally about his memories of the land and people in the 1930s.
In the 1930s, I could look overhead and see Kansas blowing by, the drought and the dust storms out west. Also, my neighbors were skinning pine bark, working in a sawmill, 10 cents an hour. That's the kind of situation that was common throughout the territory. And yet, most of us didn't realize we were in a depression. This was routine, absolute routine. As a youngster growing up in Caldwell County, graduated from high school in 1937. No jobs available, no jobs available. I finally found a job at a sawmill doing off-bearing, which is carrying the slabs across the pile and dumping them. And he said, Harley, you got it made. You're only working one way. I thought, I don't want it made that way. There must be something better. I inquired and found out there was something better for young men like me, that there was a program called Civilian Conservation Corps.
Across North Carolina, thousands of young men began enrolling in camps set up across the state beginning in 1933. Although the enrollees were civilian, the camps were run by the Army. Sleeping quarters, dining and daily formation had the flavor of the military. As in the military, each unit was called a company and given a number. To help the young enrollees, LEMs or limbs were hired. At each camp, limbs were local experienced men, adults who served as mentors and work bosses. The CCC crews worked on U.S. Forest Service lands, state and national parks, private lands, the Blue Ridge Parkway, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. The CCC seemed to be everywhere.
The question arises repeatedly, who dreamed up this idea of a CCC program? Well, in reality, the man who gets credit, and properly so, is a man named Franklin D. Roosevelt. He personally experienced a need on his own farm, Hyde Park. He watched and looked as his land eroded and washed away. He looked and realized these pastures were going. His forest was not doing it all. He said, now what I need to do is check the erosion and get some work going. And he began doing this on his own farm. As he got became governor, he said, let's do it for the whole state of New York. And he hired young men and put them to work throughout the state of New York, doing exactly what he talked about, putting trees down, building check dams for erosion, and giving them a job instead of a handout in the Depression time. So that was the origin of it, and very properly, Mr. Roosevelt is the CCC man.
Pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
I asked Dr. Jolly to distinguish between the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA, Works Progress Administration, both New Deal programs of the Depression.
Two of the New Deal programs that were very popular, WPA and CCC. The difference between CCC and WPA has to do with age. The CCC were young men, teenagers basically, who not only were teenagers, but were assigned a camp to stay and be stationed at that camp permanently. Whereas WPA consisted of adult family members who stayed at home, commuted to work, and back home each day. Basically, quite often doing quite similar work, touching the same program, but all of it, one thing to do, was to improve the well-being of the land wherever they were.
It's no wonder that the young men in the CCC were called Roosevelt's Woodsmen, soldiers of the forest, and the Tree Army.
What did the CCC offer a young man? First of all, it offered him a way out of doom and gloom. As it was, the average young man had no hope of ever being anything except out of work, out of a job, out of hope. CCC gave him new hope, gave him a square meal every day, 3 times a day. Most of them had never had one square meal on any routine, regular time. They also offered him companionship, offered him on-the-job training, many of them learning to drive a bulldozer, for example, offered him, I think repeatedly offered him the opportunity to enjoy life with assurance that he had a bed to sleep in, and he had hope that tomorrow the same will be there.
I will never forget Dr. Jolly's description of the landscape in North Carolina in the 1930s.
As we drive by our forests today and see the beautiful green everywhere, it's hard to believe what existed back in the 1930s. I remember as a child playing in a big gully, 2 stories high. That was my playground. Why? Time and time again for years, local farmers had subsistence farming, putting nothing back into the ground, local timber cutters cutting everything inside, leaving nothing but just brush. Fire, widespread. With that fire, everything's gone its path, because right behind it comes flood, and down the creek and down the river, down the Mississippi and in the ocean went our land. Look about it. Where are the trees? They're cut. Where's the land? It's going down the river. Where is our economy? It's down the river too. We're in the midst of depression, and we begat it ourselves. The change wrought by the CC boys was very simple. Where erosion had been just literally gouged out, they came by and built check dams. Time and time again, check dams to check all that erosion. Now, those check dams have filled up and trees are going therein. Also, where the subsistence farming and timber cutting had cut everything, they went row after row after row after row, planting thousands, yea, hundreds of thousands of trees, and then control fire, so that was all protected. The end result, our state is now a green state, where previously was washed and eroded and ugly looking. Now, we're proud to have tourists see us. That's the difference, and the boys did it.
Exploring North Carolina talked to another veteran of the Great Depression and Civilian Conservation Corps. Dr. Jolly and Reverend Jack Robinson do not know each other, but each shares similar memories.
I was quite young when the Depression hit. I was born in 1923, and the Depression hit in 1929. The mills closed, and that was the principal occupation of most of my neighbors as well as my family. When the mills closed, there was no work. I later learned that 25% of the people were out of work, but I thought it was much higher percentage than that because everybody I knew was out of work. They were all mill people. We moved from the mill village to my dad's cousin on the farm. And my dad raised tobacco. And I remember one time at the end of the year, when he sold his tobacco and settled, we bought groceries at a grocery store on time, and he had 5 cents left over. So he started again. But we really didn't know we were poor because everybody was in the same boat we were. The land was very poor. Most farms used a lot of fertilizer, and even with the use of fertilizer, they were unable to really make a living. They scratched out an existence on the hills. The land was eroded, and there had been no program to reclaim the land at that time. That came later, and the land in general was improved by the CCCs. I graduated from high school in 1941. Even though I had a high school diploma, there was no work available. So I joined the CCCs, and that provided income for me, plus they sent some money home to my family, and that I was grateful for. What it really meant, it gave us a purpose, a work, a useful work, and a discipline that we had not known.
I was surprised to learn from Harley Jolly that there is much tangible evidence of the work of the CCC still around us in North Carolina today.
If I were taking you on a trip to show you the things that the boys did in this state, one place I'd take you would be the Blue Ridge Parkway. They didn't build the road, but they did beautify it. And the beauty you see there looks so natural. Why? Landscape architects designed what was to be done, and the boys did then the follow-up. They put in all of the rhododendron. They put in the wildflowers. They sloped the banks so they wouldn't wash away. They built picnic areas, rest stops, restrooms, all this territory. Why? For the use of the new traveler coming in way on down the road. In Depression time, building for leisure time. What? Go down to the Madam Mesquite. Go out to the old lodge. Look at that huge smoke tower. They took that smoke tower and converted it into a lookout. So you come up there and look at all the geese flying by. Oh, what a sight.
In addition to erosion control and reforestation, the CCC did decorative stonework. Built recreational buildings, fish hatcheries, and helped reestablish wildlife. They even built the Appalachian Trail. Camps were all over North Carolina. They were in White Lake, Manteo, Mars Hill, Raleigh, Asheville, near Cherokee, Lexington, and Johns Rock near Brevard.
In looking at and trying to research this program, I met many fascinating men. I met men who were millionaires now. I met men who were heavy equipment operators. I met men who could read and write, who when they went in were totally literate, could not read a word. I met men who also were musicians. I met men who were teachers. Why? They got an inspiration in their enlistment in the CCC. And the end result, they were better, the land was better, and the nation and our state were better.
Like most other public programs and institutions of the time, the CCC was segregated. Because approximately 10% of the population was African American, that was also the percentage of minority enrollment in the CCC. The work and training were similar, but society still required men of different skin color to work apart, even when healing the land.
One of the gentlemen I interviewed made the remark that astounded me. He said, I want to tell you, son, we CCC boys made our mark on this state, on this thing. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, look about you. Look how green it is. Look at the trees. Look about you. You don't see gullies. Look about you. Everything out there, we had a hand in making possible, and making it green.
But I had to know what the Civilian Conservation Corps did for Harley Jolly personally.
So what did it do for me? It gave me hope. It gave me food. It gave me companionship. It gave me an opportunity to grow. It gave me an opportunity to learn. It gave me finally an opportunity to be proud enough to know that I can do better than this. So I became a college professor.
The CCC had unknowingly prepared Harley and many other young men for service in World War II. Young Harley Jolly, who had joined the Army after the CCC, was at Hickam Field in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, when the war began. Jack Robinson also remembered Pearl Harbor.
In December 1941, I was in the CCC's at Johns Rock here in Pisgah National Forest. On December the 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, we were all very upset. And the next day, a good third of the company went to Asheville and signed up for the Army. They never came back. They went to straight to camp from there.
Today, 2 generations later, the work of Harley, Jack, and millions of other young men is still visible around us. While getting help for themselves, they gave nature a hand.